So what we're going to take a look at here is function operations, kind of a continuation from class, just really looking more at the multiplication and division aspects of these. Now, the multiplication one I know that we had went through in class, and really we'll kind of focus more on the division one, but I'll go through multiplication one more time just in case you need to see it again. Now remember, the first thing we want to do is we're going to be given two functions, we have to identify the domains of them first. Remember, the domain is really saying what x values can I plug in and get a y value out. Looking at 3x, I could take any number I want, plug that in for x, and multiply it by 3 and get something else out. So I know I could plug in anything. Now, if we remember from class, what we can do, you could write it in this format. You know, you could say negative infinity to infinity, or we could also say is, you could write that as just this fancy looking R. What that stands for is all real numbers. It's just an R with that line through it, because if I think about all real numbers, that would be all the numbers between negative infinity and infinity. Now, if I take a look at this second one, the issue with this is that I have, this is really the fourth root of x. So remember, when I take a look at that, that has one of the restrictions. I can't have a negative underneath an even root. So that's going to be one of those that I can't have any negative numbers. So it's going to be from 0 to infinity. Now, when I go through and I multiply, the actual operations themselves are the exponent rules. So we've done 3x times x to the 1/4 before. And like some of you guys said in class, what we're going to go through and do here is we're multiplying things at the same base. We're going to add these exponents. Exponent here is 1. Exponent there is 1/4. 1 is really just saying 4/4. It's supposed to be a 4. That would be 4/4. And what I would do, just add those two together, I'm going to have 3x to the 5/4 would be my final answer. Now, I got to look at my domain of this final answer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the two domains of the two equations that I combined earlier, and I'm going to select the more restrictive one. If I look at this, the more restrictive of these two would be 0 to infinity, because I actually have some sort of restriction. The reason why we do that is because if right here at this point, 3x, I could plug in anything to that, but at this point, this is really the fourth root of x. I can't plug everything in there. You know, I said I can only plug in 0 and positive numbers, or I'm sorry, 0 and every positive number up to infinity. So the same thing is going to happen here. You know, I could still only plug these numbers in because I could kind of work this backwards to here, and this part can only have 0 to infinity. And that's kind of the important piece to remember, that this, you know, that domain is not going to change throughout. And this, so here would be our final answer. And that's one that we went through in class. Now, the next one, really, when I do division, all I'm going to go through and say is, all right, well, f of x is 3x, and then g of x is x to the 1/4. Now, just like I had done before, I have an x on the top, x on the bottom. I'm going to try to reduce that, and what I can do, instead of adding the exponents, since I'm dividing, I would subtract the exponents. So I'm going to end up having 3x to the 4/4, subtract the 1/4, I would have 3x to the 3/4. Now, the same thing, I'm going to look at my domain. I'm going to select the more restrictive of the ones up here. Alright, so looking at them again, it's going to be 0 to infinity. Now, the only thing is, what I have to consider, I have to take a look at this step. This is the key step, and with division, a lot of people forget about this step. When I look at this, my other restriction comes into play. So if I take a look at this, I cannot have that equal 0. That cannot equal 0, because we have a fraction. You can't divide by 0. You can't break up, you know, 2 divided by 0. I can't break 2 into 0 parts. Doesn't make much sense. So looking at that, I have, instead of it just being 0 to infinity, now I also can't have 0, because if I went through and I solved this, x to the 1/4 equals 0, and I solve that, I'm going to get x equals 0. So if I plug in x equals 0, that can't happen. So instead of having the square bracket, I'm going to have the parenthesis bracket here. That's why it's always going to be important. We got to kind of look at what we're talking about here. With division, I can't have 0 in the denominator, so I'm going to have to make an additional restriction on my domain. I'm going to have to go through and do that. Now, what I want you guys to do, we have these two examples here. These were going to be the two examples that you were going to go through and do in class. So you were going to have to go through, take a look at 4x to the 1/3 as f of x, and g of x being x to the 1/2. What I want you guys to do, pause the video, give these two a try, all right, and then I'll go through and I'm going to end up putting the answers up. So pause it now, you know, jot this stuff down, do the multiplication and division, and then when you play it again, you'll be right back at the answer. So now if I take a look, here's my answers. Hopefully you guys actually did pause it and then go through and do all of this. But either way, let's take a look at a few things. The first thing we look at is the domain. Here I have 4x to the 1/3. There's no restrictions there. It's not an even root, and that is not, there's no fraction there, so it's really going to be all real numbers. Over on this one, that's really the square root of x. That's an even root. I can only go from 0 to infinity for that. And really the process is going to be similar. I'm going through, I'm going to multiplying things at the same base, add those exponents. What I need to do there is I need a common denominator to add 1/3 and 1/2. That ends up being 6, so it'll be 2/6 plus 3/6, which gives me my 4x to the 5/6. And looking at that, I select the more restrictive of these two up here, which would be 0 to infinity. Now if I look at the division one, remember I'm dividing, I'm going to have to subtract the exponents. Again, same idea, I'm going to need a common denominator. I get -1/6, and when I do that, I have to end up bringing that down to the bottom. Now we also have to consider is when I did the division, I cannot have a denominator that's equal to 0. In this case, what makes that equal 0 would be the value 0. So instead of having the square bracket down here, we are going to have a parenthesis bracket at the bottom. And that's multiplication and division, using the domains and kind of looking at these different kinds of functions for that.